people have asked that Malaya be given independence, if possible, during 1957. To the people of Malaya, I say, do your duty to your country. To obtain independence is far less difficult than to maintain it. I demand from you sacrifices and undivided loyalty to your country.
Tercapai sahaja merdeka, Persekutuan Tanah Melayu pun jadi ahli pertubuhan bangsa-bangsa bersatu. Dalam ucapannya, Datuk Dr. Ismail berkata,
It is with pride and humility that I speak before you today.
Cita-cita utama kami ialah untuk memperolehi hak dan tuah hidup sebagai negara yang bebas, merdeka dan bersatu padu di antara negara-negara bebas di dunia.
The free nations of the world.
After independence, the British leave Malaya with a heavy heart.
Rose, Rose, I love you with an aching heart. What is your future? Now we have to part.
Everybody had this very enthusiastic spirit. We'd just been independent. The government, under the leadership of Tunku Abdul Rahman and Tun Razak, we were rich. We were the #1 rubber and tin producer in the world. And out of that income, we rebuilt the country.
This is an exciting time for Malayans. Independence heralds a prosperous future that will be built on a multiracial society.
We need the Chinese to make things happen. And the Chinese need the Malays to maintain the stability of the country so that the business can run properly.
I must leave you now, but I leave my heart.
This progress encourages Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman. By his side is his trusted friend, Deputy Prime Minister Razak Hussain.
He was a good #2. He did everything. Tunku just preside. And Razak will bring him. He just ran through the agenda and said, okay lah, let's have makan.
Tunku's charisma charges a positive atmosphere, creating a conducive working environment. One of his most trusted cabinet members is Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin.
He said that Tunku was a great leader, but he was not a finance man. Numbers meant very little to him. He recalled that one occasion was about a budget, and Tunku said it was an awfully long string of numbers. And he asked my father, well, couldn't you round up the numbers? My father said, you can't do that because these are very big numbers, billions of dollars. You just can't round it up. Just make it easy for everyone to remember.
We were really representative of the aspirations of the people of Malaya, without taking into account whether we disagreed on specific issues and projects. Tunku wanted us to prosper and be stable and be happy.
I think it's because Tunku knew he could trust my father and Tun Razak to do the actual administration, that he could declare himself the happiest prime minister in this country.
With a strong team behind him, the country enjoys rapid economic growth. To outsiders, Tunku is easily leading his alliance coalition to another victory in the next general election. However, Tunku's next move shocks the nation. Meanwhile, Tan Cheng Lock, the president of the Malayan Chinese Association, or MCA, and stalwart supporter of Tunku, had fallen ill and is replaced by a young challenger who brings with him radical new ideas.
MCA under Chong Yu started to be a bit arrogant and started punching beyond their weight.
Chong Yu publicized a letter handwritten by my grandfather, and in this letter, my grandfather supported Chong Yu's request that is Chinese language, Chinese schools to be on par with Malay schools, Malay language, and the request for apportionment of 40 seats out of 104 seats. The problem was that Chong Yu made these two requests public. So it was very, very difficult because it then seemed like an ultimatum by the MCA to UMNO.
Trust is now undermined by suspicion of treachery.
My father then realized what had happened was that Chong Yu had actually dictated the letter to my grandfather, who, of course, not knowing what he was doing, actually wrote the letter in his beautiful, long handwriting and signed it.
Merdeka was achieved through strong understanding and trust between the different parties in the alliance. Now this bond is being eroded by the actions of the young reformists. Unfazed by Chong Yu's requests, Tunku, as the national leader of the alliance, stands his ground. The reasons for Tunku's resignation in April now become clear.
I think Tunku was very concerned about the elections because this was the first election after independence, and he wanted a very strong mandate amongst all three ethnic groups. And he also felt that if he resigned, he could devote his entire energy and time to winning the election and not worry about the running of the government.
A determined Tunku decides he must make his move. He confronts the young reformists in the MCA.
Tunku issued a statement saying that UMNO was prepared to contest the general elections without MCA participation. Tunku's response was debated within the Central Working Committee in the MCA, and by a very narrow margin, MCA agreed to accede to Tunku's proposal.
But Tunku's firm stand can still backfire if it is counter to public opinion. The alliance will have to wait until the general elections in a few weeks' time to know the final result.
Keputusannya sekali lagi kemenangan bagi Parti Perikatan. Rakyat telah menaruh kepercayaan akan kerajaan yang diketuai oleh Tengku Abdul Rahman.
With this triumph, Tunku Abdul Rahman is reinstalled as the Prime Minister. Now Tunku turns his attention to an old enemy, the Communists. The emergency declared by the British in 1948 is still in place. 12 years later, Tunku wants to move on.
Dengan tamatnya darurat dalam tahun 1960, satu semangat baru muncul di dada setelah mengalahkan komunis selepas berjuang selama 12 tahun. Kini, segenap tenaga rakyat ditumpukan untuk pembangunan dan kemajuan negara.
However, the communists have not given up.
When it became clear that there was no way to secure their political objectives in Malaya, attention focused to the actions of the Communist Party structure in Singapore, and the aim was to eventually win political power in Singapore.
This development in Singapore worries Tunku.
The island of Singapore is connected by a causeway with the Malay Peninsula. The island is situated on the narrow Straits of Malacca between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Chinese firms control much of the large business and trade, and the population of the island is over half Chinese.
1950 Singapore is a nation in the throes of growing pains.
Singapore had a growing population that were essentially migrant, but not enough of an economy that could support that growing population. So those kinds of conditions were rife for political unrest.
There were many material issues which were grievances that the communists could exploit.
This could be a setback for the plan that the British have in the region.
The British, who were already thinking of gradual withdrawal, gradual sort of decolonization for Singapore, in other words, handing over power. They were not about to leave yet. They had a lot of interest to protect in Singapore.
The emergency may have ended in Malaya, but Southeast Asia is still a battleground of political ideologies.
It was about who would rule the post-war world, the post-colonial world. There was the free world led by the United States and Britain, and then there was the Eastern Bloc or the communist world led by Soviet Union and later China.
For the imperialists of the world, decolonization is seen as something imminent.
After the war, there was a general feeling that imperialism is out. So they were urging all the other imperial nations of Europe to give up all their colonies. So that was a general trend.
What they wanted was to see in Southeast Asia a kind of a post-colonial region that would be friendly to Western interests.
But the British have 3 remaining territories in the region to worry about: North Borneo, Sarawak, and Brunei.
The concern what the British were thinking about was that what do we do with these 3 territories, right? Leave them alone, continue holding on to it, let them federate into one territory, or make them join the federation that they were already thinking about.
The British encouraged Tunku to consider a proposal. It is an idea that has been in the works for more than a decade. It is called the Grand Design.
The Grand Design, I think, is a phrase that tripped off the lips of Malcolm MacDonald in the mid-1950s. The Grand Design looked attractive on paper, and it would certainly have got the British out of a hole in Southeast Asia. I mean, it would have enabled them to have retreated with, I suppose, in good faith, feeling that the colonial job had been done and a new nation state had been created.
The Grand Design would solve a number of objectives. You could decolonize at one go, so you don't have to do it in many phases.
They want to hand over this place and they want to put the Borneo state in the hands of people they can trust, and they could trust the Tunku.
However, the Tunku is not convinced by this proposal. He already has enough issues at home to occupy him. Meanwhile, in Singapore, newly appointed Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew is a man with a mission. He dreams of a Singapore independent from the British.
By 1963, the British had to decide what next for Singapore. Now, the possibility is, of course, give Singapore the independence that was scheduled to happen, but as its own country or as part of the Federation. The British were not sure that giving Singapore independence on its own would really work because it was too dangerous, given that you could have a Singapore that would turn communist.
Luckily for Lee, the British are inclined to grant independence, but only under the right circumstances.
When he became Prime Minister in 1959, he knew that he would have to try to bring Singapore into Malaya, and that's where he had to convince the Tunku. And he knew that the Tunku did not believe that Singapore should join Malaya. For reasons that are well known, he didn't trust the Chinese population of Singapore. He believed that if he took Singapore in, it would just complicate politics in Malaya.
And this is where the British role would be to try and convince the Malayan leaders, look, if you leave Singapore on its own, the risks of Singapore falling into communist hands is very real.
Tengku is a person who fears communism. The British tell him, if you don't go for merger with Singapore, then communists will take over.
Even if Tunku agrees to merge Singapore with Malaya, he must first appease skeptical party members within UMNO.
We were not interested in merger. The merger was more by PAP.
There was some fear that PAP politics infiltrating into the peninsula might change the priorities and the landscape that the Malays were comfortable with.
Tunku is also worried about upsetting the racial balance in Malaya.
You are adding a huge number of Chinese from Singapore into the Federation, and this will change the balance in terms of racial political strength.
But Lee knows that despite voices of dissent within UMNO, he only needs to persuade the man at the top. In May 1961, the British encouraged Lee Kuan Yew to discreetly submit a proposal to Tunku, outlining the benefits of the grand design. The proposal contains an idea designed to appeal to Tunku.
Why don't you start considering balance that dominance of the Chinese population in Singapore looks towards Sarawak, looks towards North Borneo, looks towards Brunei.
Later that month, the Tunku gives his response publicly.
So Malaya today as a nation realizes that she cannot stand alone and in isolation. Sooner or later, Malaya should have an understanding with Britain and the peoples of the territories of Singapore, Borneo, Brunei, and Sarawak.
Those words spoken by Malaya's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman.
He launched that bombshell, as he called it, in a speech at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Singapore and suggested that that was the way forward.
He didn't say that Malaysia was going to happen. He said the time has come for us to consider seriously the possibility of Singapore joining Malaysia.
Singapura, waktu malam, lampu neon indah berkilauan.
The decision to merge Malaya and Singapore is celebrated by all.
The partition of Malaya into two parts, into the Federation and into Singapore, was seen as a very unnatural act. Singaporeans saw themselves as Malayan. They saw Malaya as one country.
Everybody thinks that Singapore is ours, and there shouldn't have been a barrier. We could have gone in, shop in Singapore, come back.
It was the place where artists would go to. It was the place where you'd go to if you wanted to get a better education, if you wanted more opportunities. Singapore is basically to Malaya what New York is to the US or London is to the UK. It was the intellectual, cultural, artistic capital.
Since the inception of the People's Action Party in 1954, its manifesto has included seeking Singapore's independence through merger with Malaya.
Merger has always been one of the aims of Singapore's people. It started off after the war because we were in the pre-Merdeka generation, and we go to university and then we meet with the people from KL, from Penang, and we all feel the same.
If you looked at the concept itself, it's a beautiful concept from economic point of view. So if all could join, we could all enjoy the common denominator of development.
Now Lee Kuan Yew is hopeful this long-held ambition will be fulfilled. He also hopes merger will address the issue of growing communist influences in Singapore, including that within his own party. One of the radical left-leaning members in particular has caught the eye of the Tunku.
Tunku specifically cited Lim Chin Siong's, and I quote, talismanic ability to organize the people of Singapore, to organize the left. Tunku feared that Lim Chin Siong would come into a unified Malaysia and organize the left wing into this coherent force against the alliance.
He was observing Singapore politics for a couple of years, but as he watched the scene in Singapore, he became increasingly concerned that Lee Kuan Yew was losing ground. Lee Kuan Yew was becoming politically weak.
Tunku had recognized that it is important for the overall security of Singapore and Malaya, for Singapore to be part of the Federation of Malaya, so the central government can control the security situation in Singapore.
Ironically, Lee Kuan Yew's political weakness is the key element needed to persuade Tunku to intervene. He believes a weak Singapore will become a hotbed for communism. Meanwhile, the Borneo territories present a different set of challenges.
So distant, you know. They don't know whether the people of Sabah and Sarawak could integrate with us. They're not sure about that because some of us have never been to Sabah and Sarawak before that.
Generally, we did not understand the complexity of the population there. We had assumed that the tribal people were like our orang asli, you know, which was ridiculous.
Regardless, the majority in the alliance put their trust in Tunku.
Although a lot of us were ignorant about the proposal, but I think we had faith in our leaders. That, I think, gave us the confidence that I think Malaysia will work.
Merger is rapidly proving to be an uphill battle for those planning it.
They were concerned about putting this puzzle together of these different territories with different histories and at different stages, I suppose, in their political and economic development.
On the northeastern tip of the great island of Borneo is Sabah, the home of the Dusun, the Murut, the Bajau and other races. Brunei, the ancient Malay Sultanate, which during the 15th century dominated almost the whole of Borneo. Largest of the three Borneo territories to join in the proposed federation is Sarawak, the land of the Dayak and Iban, Kenyah and Puna. Sarawak too has many Malays and Chinese among her people.
In the east, things are not looking any brighter. The Borneo leaders are apprehensive about the idea of merger.
The Borneo territories and Malaya had hardly anything in common. In Malaya, you have, for example, you have Sultan, you have King, you have three mainstream races, whereas in Borneo now has more than 40 ethnic communities.
People in Sarawak at that time, the level of education is still very limited. The understanding of what's happening outside is quite restricted. So their concern was, if Malaysia, as they understood it, were to happen, what role can they play?
The political environment in North Borneo
Sarawak and Brunei were very different. You didn't have political parties, you didn't have a group of people who were very interested in politics. What you have was individual leaders within the community who were starting to have an interest in politics.
The Borneo people are wary about the intentions of the Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew wanted a federation between Malaya and Singapore. It made a lot of sense because Singapore had no natural resources. Tunku, on the other hand, look at if only Malaya and Singapore federate, possibility the Malay will be outnumbered by the Chinese. And Tunku, without even having set foot in the Borneo territories, try rope in the Borneo territories. So they both want Malaysia for different reasons.
Tunku heads to Borneo on a diplomatic mission.
It was alleged that the leadership in Malaya at that time was too assumptuous that Sabah and Sarawak were just like Malays. My complaint was that lots of Malayans, people from UMNO, for example, who visited there, they would make a speech, they will come out and Assalamualaikum, come out with hadiths, everything else. Then after the event, you realize the whole group was a group of Christians.
I think the Tunku probably was naive in thinking, if we get these Borneo people, they're just like us, and that will, racially, so on and so forth, that's a counterweight to the Chinese, job done. And it wasn't as simple as that, of course.
An influential North Borneo leader emerges to oppose this plan, together with leaders from Parti Rakyat Brunei and the Sarawak United Progressive Party, or the SUPP.
There was quite a groundswell of opposition to Tunku, and he went on a number of goodwill visits. It really stirred up a lot of bad will.
After the trip to Borneo, Tunku is unsure about the future of merger. The divide between the people of Borneo and Malaya seems too wide.
In North Borneo and Sarawak, there was no religious factor. For example, the development of UMNO and PAS in Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya was all about Islam, Malay nationalism and protection of the sultans. These were non-issues in North Borneo and Sarawak because simply Islam was not a factor.
Without the participation of the Borneo states, the demographic balance will not be to Tunku's liking. Tunku is adamant that the Borneo leaders must agree to the proposal if any progress is to be made. The Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, realizes he must take up the challenge.
I was told that the man who really wanted Malaysia to come into being, apart from the British, was Lee Kuan Yew himself.
Lee Kuan Yew is a real strong man. Everything he wants, he must get it. That is his character.
He wants to make a success. He wants to create this Malaysia. So if those people are not joining, I will go and tell them how good it is. It's not so much Tunku asking him. He wants it.
Malaya's Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, needs the consent of North Borneo, Sarawak and Brunei to form a greater federation together with Singapore. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew is determined to work hard to persuade them. But first, Tunku extends an invitation to the Borneo leaders to visit Malaya.
Meanwhile, representatives from Sabah and Sarawak called on the Malayan Prime Minister to obtain a first-hand idea of what the Malaysia plan would mean for their countries. In his usual sincere and frank manner, the Tunku explained that Malaysia would not only hasten their independence, it would bring untold benefits as well.
During the visit, Tunku's deputy Razak Hussain explains to the Borneo leaders the progress made since independence.
Most of us have some inkling of what Malaya was all about. It is not only Merdeka, it is Merdeka with an effort to develop our country to be better.
Razak takes the Borneo leaders on a tour.
We want to find out what is this proposal really about. We were shown around a lot of schools, a lot of new roads, a lot of new water supply, electricity. I was really impressed with the development that had been shown to us. And I even said this, that even besok pun saya bersedia masuk Malaysia.
Next, members of the legislative assemblies of Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo decide to proceed with formal discussions regarding the idea.
The members decided to set up the Malaysian Solidarity Consultative Committee, and they discussed this idea that Tunku articulated in May.
Surprisingly, the committee appoints the skeptical North Borneo leader, Donald Stevens, as their chairman. For months, he has shown reluctance to the idea of bringing North Borneo to merge with Malaya. It is Singapore's Lee who recommends that Stevens heads the committee.
Guan Yu was a very good personal friend of Donald Stevens. They meet up quite regularly, even before the idea of Malaysia was touted. They had a fair idea of how to work together.
The Malayan and Singapore leaders look at Donald Stevens as the most influential, the most articulate, and possibly at the time, the most literate of the Borneo Territories leaders.
Sambutan tiba serta-merta. Ahli-ahli mesyuarat dari ke-5 wilayah itu melapaskan kesanggupannya atas gagasan Malaysia itu. Persetujuan ini adalah satu keagungan dalam persidangan pertama Jawatan Kuasa Perunding Sejakawan Malaysia di Jesselton pada bulan Ogos tahun itu.
Discussions are intense and many issues are debated. Ultimately, it comes down to one question.
There is nothing else they really want to find out but to find out from us or from the people whether we want Malaysia or whether we do not want Malaysia.
Of course, Sabah and Sarawak, they're practically new to this idea. They're not so sure about their future. So instead of coming along with this idea of Tengku forming Malaysia, they were thinking of banding together with the 3S, Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore. They finally came to a resolution that all these territories should be one, including Brunei.
The committee recommended the continuation of the present system of the appointment of His Majesty the Young Di-Pertuan Agong as sovereign ruler of the new federation. The new states would each have its own head of state and its own constitution. Although Islam would be the official religion, there would be complete freedom of worship.
But the work is not completely done. While the MSCC is holding discussions, Singapore's Prime Minister Lee is facing tough opposition to merger in his own country. His opponents in the Socialist Front, or Barisan Socialis, say that the process must not be rushed. But Lee Kuan Yew has made merger a key pillar of his manifesto. Lee knows he must win the Singaporean public to his side.
Good evening. Soon, you will have to decide on your future. In the next few months, we shall settle the constitutional arrangements for merger. Merger is going to take place, not just because it's the desire of the PAP, or merely because it is the wish of the Federation Alliance government. It is as inevitable as the rising and setting of the sun.
He engages in a series of 12 radio broadcasts.
The battle for merger was really a battle for the hearts and minds of the population in Singapore, because it pretty much at that time determined whether or not Singapore would go it alone or become independent as part of a larger political entity.
Oh yes, it worked very hard. The better for the merger. We were over the radio to tell the people the merger with the Malaya is good for Singapore. Singapore cannot survive by itself.
Through the radio talks, Lee Kuan Yew cautions the public about a grave threat in Singapore.
If we did not join Malaya and form Malaysia, we can have a big problem with the communists.
He uses this to drive home the idea that merger would suppress or even eliminate the threat of communism in the region.
The idea that the communist forces were advancing throughout Southeast Asia was very much a concern and fear amongst the non-communist governments and societies in Southeast Asia. So the next question was, what's going to happen to Singapore and Malaya? Very much a front in the Cold War as well.
Lee Kuan Yew works tirelessly day and night. In the next few weeks, he uses valuable airtime to ensure Singaporeans understand the urgent need to win the battle for merger. Meanwhile, the Malaysia Solidarity Consultative Committee, or MSCC, continues its meetings.
At the third meeting in Kuala Lumpur, the Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman declared that all states in Malaysia would enjoy equal rights and status. But due to the special position of Singapore, the city-state would retain local powers in labour and education. The meeting discussed the economic and financial implications of Malaysia and what it meant in terms of national development. Piece by piece, the Malaysia jigsaw fell into place to produce a glowing picture of a vigorous young nation in the making.
It was Lee Kuan Yew who managed to swing their thinking around so that they would band together and support Tunku's idea.
And Tunku's plea of good faith assures the Borneo leaders that the future is bright.
Malaysia could not have been formed in spite of the hard effort put in by Lee Kuan Yew, if not for the fact that Tunku gave his personal assurances that he will definitely take care of the people of Sabah and Sarawak, not to worry, for as long as he is the leader of this newly formed federation.
If you put your faith in his hand, he will look after it and with all the sincerity at his commands. Because of that, I think it was very easy for us to sell Malaysia.
The successful ending of the conference was celebrated by a big cultural show in which all the countries of the new nation were represented.
The Malaysian Solidarity Consultative Committee proves to be a great platform for the leaders to discuss Malaysia. In November 1961, Tunku, Lee Kuan Yew and the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, meet in London to advance discussions about Malaysia.
The conference of November 1961 agreed two principles. The first was that British defence interests in Singapore would be preserved, and the other was that the wishes of the Borneo people should be consulted, should be ascertained.
The British established a commission of inquiry to listen firsthand to the people of Borneo about their concerns on Malaysia.
Suruhanjaya Kabul yang memulakan kerjanya dalam bulan Februari 1962 menarik minat ke 55 wilayah. Maksud tugasnya ialah untuk menentukan pendapat orang-orang Sabah dan Sarawak terhadap pembentukan Malaysia itu dan membuat syur-syur yang sewajarnya.
It was chaired by Lord Cobbold, a former governor of the Bank of England, and on it were two representatives of Malaya and two representatives of the British side who were there to, I suppose, protect the interests of the Borneo peoples.
Even at that time, there were still pockets of reservation in Sarawak. Not so much then from people from the rural country, but certainly within the more urban, particularly the Chinese component, there was still resistance to the idea of Malaysia. One of the arguments used to promote the idea of Malaysia is this sense of security. That security is, if you're on, you will not be safe.
In the end, the voice of the people is heard.
Tunku Abdul Rahman in particular keep on assuring that there was no plan to colonize Sarawak. It is not Malaya's intention to do that. What he wanted was a merger of people who he said were from the same stock generally. While Malaya was prepared to share their expertise, it will give them better prospect of sharing their resources.
When we put this idea to the vast majority of the people of Sarawak, said, why not? We would like to be part of Malaysia.
They went around Sabah, Sarawak, persuaded the people. They were accompanied by the leaders who said, it's good for you.
Before going back home, Soviet Premier Khrushchev gets in some parting shots at the United Nations.
Могила колониальному рабству! Долой его и похоронить его чем глубже, тем лучше!
Not since the Second World War has so much animosity and division existed between two superpowers. One of the Soviet Union's allies in Southeast Asia is uneasy with the developments in the region.
He saw the creation of Malaysia as actually a neo-colonial creation of the British. In other words, the British in name pulled out, but actually they are still there through their proxies in Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew.
President Sukarno stokes the fires on the international stage to divert attention from issues at home.
Sukarno had a lot of domestic problems. He was making a very delicate balance between the communists and the military who hated each other, and he was maintaining that balance. Now, so he decided that the best way to deal with that was to turn attention outside. So when the idea of Malaysia was mooted, he said, what is this?
A diplomat at heart, Malaya's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman tries to persuade Sukarno to back down from his aggressive stance. Nothing must come in the way of forming Malaysia.
Babak seterusnya kini beralih ke London. Persidangan penting mengenai Malaysia diadakan di antara pemimpin-pemimpin Melaya dengan jemaah Menteri British. Asas perbincangan ialah laporan Suruhanjaya Kabul. Selepas sekian berunding, Tunku Abdul Rahman dan Perdana Menteri British Tuan Harold Macmillan pun mewujudkan perjanjian bersejarah atas Malaysia itu. Agung dalam persetujuan itu ialah masa peralihan dan penyerahan kedaulatan.
The date has been set in London for the new federation to be formed. As with the Merdeka mission in 1956, when Malaya secured its independence, Tunku once again has shown a deft touch when negotiating the formation of a new nation. And he is one step closer to forming one of the biggest territories in Southeast Asia.
Jalan untuk tertubuhnya negara baru Malaysia itu sudahlah terbentang dengan jelasnya. Inilah yang dikehendaki satu teladan. Karena dunia pada waktu ini bergaduh berbagai-bagai, bergaduh kerana kelas orang ni lain, bergaduh kerana bangsa orang ni lain, bergaduh kerana bahasa orang ini lain, bergaduh kerana agama orang ini lain. Tapi bagi pihak kita, kita boleh hidup dengan baik, dengan manis muka, dengan perasaan kasih mesra antara satu dengan lain. Tidak terkira apa bangsa, apa agama, apa rupa, apa kulit, apa pun kita tak kira, asal kita boleh duduk sama sekali sebagai satu bangsa. Hidup Malaysia. Hidup Malaysia. Merdeka Malaysia. Merdeka Malaysia. Saya minta rakan saya Encik Lee Kuan Yew bagi sepatah dua cakapan kepada tuan-tuan. Sudah 100 lebih tahun Singapura menjadi satu pusat perniagaan dalam Asia Tenggara. Dan 1.600.000 lebih orang di Singapura adalah kebolehan, keusahaan yang boleh menolong negeri kita menjadi satu negeri yang lebih bahagia. Itulah maksud Persekutuan Malaysia. Bukan sebagai Radio Moskow cakap ini apa penjajahan yang baru. Kalau bukan kaki tangannya kuasai negeri, dia kata itu penjajahan baru. Tapi kalau kaki tangannya sendiri, dia kata itu bagus, itu kemerdekaan yang bebas, dia kata. Merdeka Malaysia! Bersemangat sikit tuan-tuan. Kalau lemah begini, tak dapat merdeka Malaysia. Merdeka Malaysia! Terima kasih tuan-tuan.
Kita akui dengan sombong dan megah akan kejayaannya yang cemerlang. Allah lanjutkanlah usianya memandu untung nasib negara baru kita. Merdeka Malaysia!